Thank you for the opportunity to speak with you today. I'm sorry that I couldn't be in Nevada in person, but it's a pleasure to be with you nonetheless. So, I was involved in a recent effort in Utah to create a water banking program for the state, the first ever in Utah. And so, what I hope to talk today about are some of my experiences and the collective experiences of our water banking group, which put this legislation together. Although I recognize that Nevada and Utah are different, I hope that there are some commonalities that you may find of interest. I understand that Nevada is currently considering a water banking program of its own and maybe looking at our bill as an example. So with that in mind, what I hope to do is go over the process we used to create our bill, explain a little bit about what we were thinking, and then hopefully talk about some of the takeaways that may be of use in Nevada. So one of the main reasons why we started to look at water banking in Utah stems from this. This is our population projections for the next 35 years. And right now, Utah has about 3.2 million people. We expect that population will nearly double in the next 30 or so years. And that obviously creates a number of pressures on our water supply. I believe that this is a similar problem in Nevada, which has I think almost the same population, is experiencing significant population growth as well. Like Nevada, Utah is almost fully appropriated. Our water is all accounted for at the current time, which means that in order to account for this population growth, water is going to have to come from an existing use. And in Utah, that almost always means agriculture. And for most of what we've seen over Utah's history with its population growth, particularly I would say over the last 50 years, most of that growth has been replacement in place, meaning that if you're going to build a subdivision, you buy a farm and you put houses on it. And the economic activity associated with that development stays in the community. But what I'm concerned about, and I think many other folks in Utah's water community are as well, is that what happens when you run out of farms in our population centers, particularly in the Wasatch Front. Are we going to see things that we've seen in other states, particularly Colorado, where development goes further afield into rural communities, takes that water, and then ships it to the Wasatch Front, along with the economic activity associated with those rights? So that's one of the significant concerns we have in this state about what we're going to do, because I think there's a general consensus that we want to preserve agriculture. But at the same time, we have a lot of other pressures and needs too. We have some environmental issues that we need to address. There's, I think, an increasing demand by our public that we have full reservoirs and streams, that we address some of the water quality challenges that we have, that basically we want it all. And in order to do that, we're going to have to figure out how to share water or do things a little bit differently than we have in the past, but do so in a way, hopefully, at least in my opinion, that doesn't come at the expense of agriculture. So with that in mind, a couple of years ago, the Governor Herbert put together a team of water professionals really to represent a whole host of different sectors from Utah's water community. And he asked them to develop a recommended water strategy, which came out in 2017. Now, that recommended strategy wasn't mandatory by any means, but it did include a number of different recommendations on things that Utah could do to address this problem. And there were a number of recommendations, and I've included some of them here, that identified water banking as a potential tool. It was identified as something that could be used to help agricultural water interests, basically to allow them to bank water for future needs. It identified water banking specifically as a tool for in-stream flows, and also a way to help facilitate temporary transfers of water and other voluntary agreements. One of the challenges we have in Utah, and I think it's similar to many Western states, is that it just takes time to move water from one use to another. And it's also very hard to find willing buyers and willing sellers in some parts of the state. It's not like buying a house or a car where you can go online and see what's available and how much it costs. It's sometimes a very opaque process. And because it can be difficult to find and buy water and then transfer it, and because in some cases it can take months, if not years, to do that, there really is more of an incentive to buy water on a permanent basis, and in many cases to buy more water than you need. And so it's not uncommon to see huge portions of agricultural water rights purchased, perhaps more so than than what's actually needed, and then that water is transferred over to an urban use where it stays there forever. And so a lot of these recommendations were really trying to get at, I think, one common theme, and that is, how do we come up with temporary transfers? How do we come up with an alternative to the buy and dry permanent transfer approach that's currently the norm in Utah? So interestingly enough, when this report came out, there were 3 other efforts that were already underway. And they each kind of tackled a different part of this population growth challenge. There was a group led by Representative Tim Hawks that was focused on ways to improve things for agriculture, particularly to come up with incentives by which agriculture could make money with its water that didn't involve selling out, particularly ways that they could continue to farm and increase efficiencies and get compensated for it. There was another group led by some of our larger conservancy group districts trying to figure out ways to use banking and other interruptible supply agreements or option agreements to help address urban water needs. And then there was another group led by Senator Janie Iwamoto, a Democrat from Salt Lake, that was looking at ways to do in-stream flows. And so when this report came out, everyone read it and said, well, hey, water banking seems to be the thing that was recommended to deal with our challenge. And so all these different groups, many of which included some of the same people, I was on 2 of these, the Ag and the In-Stream Flow group, ultimately ended up combining into what became our water banking group. And ultimately this group grew to about 80 or so folks. This is a list of some of the people, some of the interests that were involved, but it was a pretty well-balanced group of government representatives from the key water agencies. The Bureau of Reclamation participated. We had pretty good involvement from local government, and then we had a whole host of folks from the private sector. The Utah Farm Bureau was involved from the start. We had a number of other entities that were very ag focused, as well as some environmental folks, the Home Builders Association, and a large swath of other folks as well. Interestingly enough, this group was entirely open. Anybody who wanted to participate in it could, and we worked in a very consensus-driven manner, meaning that we didn't move forward unless we could get everybody on board, which was a bit of a challenge given how large our group was, but it ultimately worked. What we ended up proposing to the legislature was a consensus bill that had broad support. So one of the first things that we did as a group, and this was a 3.5-year effort, one of the first things that we did was start to think about, well, what is water banking, at least the type of banking that was envisioned in the governor's report. And when we distilled it down to its essence, what we were all trying to figure out is, what type of a mechanism can we create that facilitates temporary voluntary water market transactions that basically allow one person to use another person's water rights on a temporary basis, but get that water back easily with relatively low transaction costs. And one of the things that we did when we were working on this is we studied water banking around the country. Utah is one of the few states that really didn't have much going on in the terms of water banking. Most Western states have some type of water banking, and Utah was one of the few exceptions. And so we went around and we studied other Western states to see what they were doing. We also went around Utah to see what's happening now. And in addition, if we were to do water banking, what would it look like? And so one of the things we found as we did this was that there were a couple things that we felt are already happening that we'd like to improve or make easier, not replace, but come up with a mechanism that could really facilitate certain things. And one of which was leases. You can lease water now under Utah law, but like I said before, it's hard to find willing buyers and sellers. It's hard to get information on pricing. And so if we could come up with a mechanism that would help put lessors and lessees together, that would be something that might help with some of the governor's recommendations. We also saw around the West that you see some rotational fallowing programs, for instance, in Colorado and California, in which irrigation companies, lease a portion of their water through fallowing, but it's rotational fallowing, so it's not the same water right every year, and it's not the same fields that are being fallowed, but it's a way to provide firm water supplies to satisfy urban growth without drying up the farmers and providing some hard cash for on-farm improvements and other things. We found a number of rental pools, conservation credits. So these are the types of water market activities that we were hoping to facilitate and encourage through a water banking program in Utah. So one of the first things that we did is Utah, like most Western states, 85% of our water is used in agriculture. And we knew that since one of our key objectives was to help ag and help preserve ag, we did not want to do anything that would hurt agriculture. And we wanted to come up with something that the agricultural community could support or at least be comfortable with. And so the Farm Bureau, as I mentioned, participated in this effort from the start. A gentleman named Sterling Brown was at pretty much all of these meetings and was invaluable. And we went to Sterling and we said, hey, we want to do water banking. That seems to be what one of the common themes in the governor's strategy. What does the Farm Bureau think? And Sterling said, well, we actually already have a policy on water banking, and it's something we've been thinking about for a while, and here's our policy. And basically, their policy focused on voluntary water banking to benefit agriculture as long as control was maintained by the local irrigation companies. And so we used this as our starting point, and we came up with this goal that we used, basically tried to use as much of the language from the Farm Bureau's policy as possible. And we came up with essentially three goals. One, it needed to be voluntary. This couldn't be something that was mandated by the state. Two, again, it needed to be temporary. As I said, we do a good job of taking water out of ag. We don't do a good job of putting it back in. And so we wanted this to be something that instead of forcing farmers or creating market incentives in which it just makes sense to sell out, that there would be another relief valve that wasn't a permanent buy and dry mechanism. And lastly, we wanted it to be local. Initially, the Farm Bureau's policy focused on irrigation companies managing the banks, but as we studied it out, there are many parts of the state where there aren't irrigation companies. Maybe it's a city, or maybe it's a privately held right. And so we changed that to be locally driven by local right holders. And ultimately, the Farm Bureau, which supported this bill, did actually change its policy to account for that aspect of the bill. So this was the goal. This was the theme that we used to develop our program. And I want to talk a little bit more about why, as we studied this, we felt that local control would be so critical. And part of it is, one of the first things that we did is we said, well, what states have really robust water banking programs? Where are the states that are doing a lot of banking now? And Idaho is one, if not the most well known when it comes to water banking. And Idaho has a couple different tools, but the one that we kind of looked at first initially was a water bank that's run at the state level. And we quickly realized that while that's a very good program for Idaho, and in talking with the folks there that run their bank, we realized it probably wouldn't work very well for Utah. And the main reason for that is that most of Idaho is within the Columbia River Basin, and particularly the Snake River. And it's a very large river, and there's a lot of water users and population centers along that river system. Utah is very different in that sense. And as you can see from this map, it's much more compartmentalized. We have a lot of smaller basins, and they don't necessarily mix and match. And so most of our population center is located in the Bear River, Weaver River, and particularly the Jordan River basins. That's where 85% of the state lives. And we do have some folks down in the lower Colorado River and southwestern Utah in the St. George area. But for the most part, the other parts are very rural. And we realized if we tried to do something on a statewide basis, something that makes sense in, say, the Jordan and Salt Lake could be disastrous in, say, the Cedar or in the Beaver River systems. And so we realized that we could do something that would work from a top down. It needed to be bottom up. And I don't know enough about Nevada to speak with a whole lot of informed knowledge on this, but my understanding is Nevada is in kind of a similar boat, that you don't have a lot of water either. In fact, Nevada's famously the driest state, and many people consider Utah to be the second driest. And I think part of that is due to the fact that we don't have something like the Columbia River flowing through our states. We do have the Colorado, but in Utah's case, most of our population isn't located anywhere near the Colorado River. So we wanted these banks not to be very large enterprises, but to be small, localized, locally managed efforts that maybe aren't even managed at a basin level. In fact, I think that would probably be too large. Our thinking was that these could be managed at a sub-basin or a sub-drainage level. So that is a little bit of background on why we were so focused on coming up with something that was local. We just didn't think we could do a one-size-fits-all statewide approach and have it work in an equitable way. So with that in mind, here's the timeline of how this came together. Our group started in 2017. Like I said, we spent about a year and a half studying water banking, coming up with different concepts, going around the state, chatting with people. In 2019, the legislature passed Senate Joint Resolution 1, which called for the study of water banking and asked our group to put together some recommendations for what a possible program would look like for the 2020 session. The legislature also appropriated $400,000 to help with the study, which we were able to use working with the Division of Water Resources to get a matching $400,000 Water Smart grant from the federal government. And ultimately, we did put together a bill, SB 26, which Senator Iwamoto and Representative Tim Hawks sponsored. It was a bicameral and bipartisan bill, and that bill passed unanimously in 2020. And so we've had this program in effect for about a year, where COVID has put us behind in terms of getting things off the ground, but we've been doing quite a bit of work on it, and I'll talk a little bit about where we are towards the end of my presentation. So in terms of the key concepts of the water banking bill, we really tried to take as much language as we could from the governor's recommended water strategy. We were really trying to do what that recommended strategy suggested. And so because of that, the bill has a section that talks about what it's trying to promote and what it's trying to facilitate. And if you have a water bank, if you're creating a water bank, it needs to basically promote these things and facilitate these things. And so it doesn't mean that you have to do this with every bank necessarily, but the idea is that banks would be open to multiple different types of uses. The traditional uses that we've always had, like agriculture and industrial and domestic use, but also water quality and in-stream flows and a natural environment. These are things that the governor's strategy recommended and that we incorporated into the bill. So with that in mind, I want to talk a little bit about the process that you would use to create a bank. And there are two types of banks that you can create under our program. One is a contract bank and one is a statutory bank. And I'll talk about what those mean in a second. But basically, we wanted to create a process that would create kind of a framework, a paint by numbers, so to speak, that would give local right holders a general idea of some of the overarching concepts that they need to think about. So create a framework that would get them thinking about how banking would work, but also empower them to fill out the nitty-gritty specifics that are going to be unique to their individual areas. And so basically, in order to create a bank, the way that this process works is ideally local stakeholders and right holders need to sit down, if they want to do this, again, it's voluntary, and think about, what could my bank look like? Who needs to be at the table? For instance, if I'm in an area where there's a large water company, that company's pretty much going to have to be at the table. Otherwise, the bank's not going to work. And if they don't want to do it, it's not going to happen. We also wanted people to think about, what type of bank am I trying to create? What is the purpose of this, and how should it be organized? We wanted our banking system to build off of as many existing laws as possible. And so one of the early questions we had is, well, what type of legal entities are these banks? And we ultimately felt that that's best left to the individual right holder who's creating the bank. Is it going to be a nonprofit entity, similar to an irrigation company? Is it an interlocal agreement? Is it an S corp or a for-profit enterprise? What is it? We felt that it would be best if the local right holders determined what that would be. So one of the things we found when we were looking into banking is that we're really two different types of needs and interest across the state for two different types of water transactions. One was what we ultimately created our contract banks to facilitate. And what we found is that a lot of right holders were already involved in sort of gentlemen's temporary informal agreements that were accomplishing some pretty interesting things, but weren't legally enforceable at the end of the day. And a lot of those folks were like, I'd really like this to be legally enforceable because I want to take it to the next step. I want to invest more money in this, but I'm not going to get funding, or I'm not going to put the type of money that's needed into this informal agreement unless it's legally enforceable. At the same time, we didn't want to encourage speculation, and we didn't want to have contracts that would be disadvantageous for other water right holders. And so what we ultimately came up with is a process by which these contracts can essentially become qualified as a bank and get legal recognition. But in order to create one of those contract banks, the sponsor has to be a local or a state public entity. And the reason we did that was, one, to make sure that there's at least some public benefit to these types of contracts, and two, to bring these contracts within all the transparency laws that apply to government entities in Utah, meaning that if you do one of these contracts, it'll have to be approved and discussed in an open and public meeting, that all the financial aspects of this can be subject to Utah's sunshine law, so that they can't be hidden and done in a back room when it comes down to it. The second type of bank that we saw a lot of demand for was basically some type of an institution to help facilitate willing buyers and willing sellers, for lack of a better term, an Airbnb for water rights. And that's what we created our statutory banks to be. Those are basically banks in which the water right holders define a service area and say, hey, here is the section of stream or the little groundwater basin that we're going to be working in. And the point of those banks is to get all the water rights that are deposited in there pre-approved by the state engineer in a given area. And so if you're someone who's interested and needs water, for instance, let's say I'm a farmer and I have junior rights and I typically get cut off in July and I'd like to farm in August, I could go to a bank in my area and say, hey, I want to lease water this season. And maybe instead of having to do that a year or two in advance, you can go in, say, July and say, hey, what water rights are available for August? And they're already pre-approved and you can lease them. So that's a quick background on the two different types of banks that our program authorizes. So if you've decided to create a bank, if you've determined what type of legal entity it's going to be, where it's going to be operating, how it's going to be structured, and whether it's a contract or a statutory bank, the next process is to do as follows. We felt that there needed to be some state oversight, but we didn't want it to be too burdensome. And so in order to create a bank, the first step is you need to fill out an application to the Board of Water Resources. And this application is really intended to be a checklist of all the general concepts that we felt people needed to think about. Most importantly, where is your service area? Now, again, as I mentioned, under Utah water law, it's not that easy to transfer water over large distances. And so we really feel that we've tried to set this up in a way in which these banks will be very locally focused. Secondly, how's your bank going to operate? For instance, what type of funding mechanisms are you going to have? Is if you're doing a statutory bank and it's just a water market, are you a bulletin board in which you just people put their rights that are leased, or do you operate something a little bit more akin to Idaho's, where you say, hey, here's the water we have and it's one flat rate because you're worried about deeper pocketed interest pricing out the little guy? Who are your governing members going to be? How are they appointed, or how do they get there? All of those sort of structural, fundamental questions we felt needed to be considered by people creating a bank. And so basically the way this works is they submit an application, they submit it to the Board of Water Resources, and the Board of Water Resources then makes sure that that application is complete. There is one difference between a contract and a statutory bank, because contract banks are already subject to the various public entity requirements. We felt that a statutory bank at least needed to have a public hearing so that the public would be aware of the bank. Under Utah's laws, for a public entity to approve a contract bank, it would need to be noticed and discussed in a public meeting. And so this was intended to be kind of a parallel to that. Now, importantly, the board, as long as the application is complete, does not have the ability to deny an application. It just has to be complete. And so if people come and say, this is a terrible idea, that doesn't play into the board's ability to approve or deny a bank. Where that comes into play, however, is in the next phase when you get to the operation of a water bank. So all the Board of Water Resources approval does is just create a water bank. Similar to in Utah, if you want to create a corporation, you file your articles and bylaws with the Division of Corporation. There's not really a review process as to whether you have a good idea or not. Where the rubber really hits the road is that once you've created the bank, you need to file a change application to actually move any water right or water rights into the bank to effectively make your deposits. And that's where, if you're concerned about the bank, that's where you would file your objections. And all of the same protections and process that applies under Utah's normal change application process will apply to water bank applications. So if the service area is defined in a way in which it's going to impair other water rights, the state engineer is not going to allow a water right to be moved into that bank. And similarly, the state engineer has authority to condition how water rights are used. So for instance, If you define your service area as, say, 2 miles of a stretch of river, and the state engineer may say, hey, this right can be used on mile 1, but mile 2, that's how we hope that this provision, this approach will allow people some more flexibility, but also provide the same protections we already currently have under our existing framework. And then obviously, if you disagree with the water right being moved into a bank, you can file a protest, and if it's still approved over your protest at the administrative level, you can challenge it in court. And then, of course, once it's in the bank and can be leased and used either pursuant to the contract if it's a contract bank or pursuant to the service area if it's a statutory bank, water would be distributed in the same way as any other water right would, pursuant to whatever decrees, change in state engineer orders, and just basically our normal distribution system with their water commissioners. So one of the things that we were very acutely aware of when we were doing this is this is a new concept. Even though banking is not a new concept, this is a unique approach, and it's a Utah-specific approach, and we don't know exactly how it's going to work. And so because of that, the legislation has an automatic 10-year sunset, meaning that it's term limited. It'll automatically expire in 2030 unless the legislature extends it. And we wanted to study and test this concept out. And so what we've done is created annual reporting requirements. So every bank, contract or statutory, has to file an annual report with the Board of Water Resources. And if they don't, the bank will be shut down. And the reason why those annual reports are so important is that because the Board of Water Resources will use those reports, which will be public records. So there's, again, some more transparency. And they will provide an annual report to the legislature each year about how the water banking program is working. And that will allow the legislature basically to have an agenda item each year on water banking and to make tweaks and emergency changes or fix other problems that may arise as we go along. Personally, I expect that we're going to see some tweaks and changes to this program as we progress. And I hope that that's in fact what actually does in fact happen. So our intention here is to do this on an incremental basis, to go slow and steady, to study this out. So this isn't a set and forget it approach. So with that in mind, I want to talk about some of the key provisions and protections found within the bill. So some of the key provisions that apply to this bill are: one, ownership doesn't change. So if you put water into your bank, it's just like a financial institution. You own that water. The bank may lease it out to somebody else, but it's still your water. You own it. Title doesn't change. Importantly, change applications can only be term limited when they go into bank, up to 2030. And so what that means is when your change application expires under Utah law, that means it automatically reverts back to its prior use. No further applications or bureaucracy is required. Secondly, right holders can use the rights that they've deposited into a bank for their old historic uses as long as it's not being leased by someone else. So if, let's say, you deposit water into the bank and it sits there for a year or two before someone leases it, you can use it as you always have. But once it's leased by someone else, then they're using it and you can't double dip. And lastly, you can withdraw your water from a bank at any time, just like you can take money out of a financial institution, as long as it doesn't violate the terms of a lease or other agreements or rules that the bank may establish, which you would, of course, voluntarily need to agree with when you put the water in the bank in the first place. In order to make banking work, pretty much every program that we studied requires that water placed within a bank is not subject to abandonment or forfeiture. And what that means is, let's say I put 5 acre-feet into a bank, but it just sits there for 2 or 3 years. We didn't want those 2 or 3 years to count towards Utah's abandonment or forfeiture tolling process, which is 7 years of non-use. So it's protected, but that doesn't mean that if your right's already subject to non-use or is already subject to abandonment or forfeiture, putting in the bank somehow launders those rights and removes that limit, that potential forfeiture. The other thing that we found, and this was something that our agricultural colleagues were very helpful with, is there was a significant concern amongst a lot of folks, particularly farmers and rural folks, that, hey, I'm interested in this concept, but I don't want a big, powerful city to lease my water and then at the end of the lease say, hey, I'm just going to condemn it. Now, condemnation is allowable under Utah law for water rights, but I'm only aware of one situation where it's actually been used. And so to address this concern, we put a clause in here that basically says that if you're the person who is leasing the right, so if I'm a city leasing someone's right, After the end of that lease, I can't bring condemnation proceedings against that right for 5 years. And we wanted to do that to basically protect these rights. So this is the only protection you really can find under Utah law right now against condemnation. And so that was why we included that, and it turned out to be a very key provision. And the last one is you can't mix groundwater and surface water. So if I create a bank to market and sell my surface water rights, I can't accept groundwater rights, and I can't allow my surface water right to be used for diverted through groundwater wells, and vice versa. If I create a groundwater well, a groundwater bank, I can't mix and match with surface water rights. So I mentioned earlier that we got about $800,000 in state and federal funding. We're using this to study to help set up 3 demonstration banks. These were 3 areas that raised their hand very early in the process and said, hey, we're interested in this. The Cache Valley area is located in northeast Utah near the city of Logan. This is an area that historically has been a very strong agricultural economy. It's growing relatively rapidly. And they've determined that they have enough water to satisfy their future growth demands, but only if they dry up all of their agriculture, which is a poison pill for this area. And so they've been trying for many years to do water banking. The Utah State University is located there. It's studied water banking very extensively. And so their focus is on how do we preserve ag? How do we keep ag in this area as a viable part of our community and economy in the face of this growth? The Schneiderville Basin is located near Park City. This is a very dry area. I have a number of clients here. Water is very expensive. I just did, for instance, a deal where the water was $30,000 an acre foot, which in Utah is the most expensive water that I've ever seen. And so this is an area where they're trying to get water back into some key streams. And so this is one that's more focused on in-stream flows. And then the last is the Price area, and that's an area kind of in the center of the state located in the Colorado River Basin. And they've got kind of all of these issues. They have some environmental issues. They have some agricultural interest. They already have some water transactions that are happening. They're trying to come up with a cleaner, more transparent process there. And there's some industrial and urban uses in that area of the state as well. We've used this funding to hire a program manager. In fact, a program manager team led by Emily Lewis. She's an attorney that worked with me to draft a lot of this bill and to help facilitate the discussions that led to this bill being enacted. But importantly, she's going to be working with these program areas to help set up these banks. She's also going to be working on a statewide water marketing strategy. Hopefully, we're going to use the lessons learned from these demonstration programs to see how water banking and water marketing generally works and see if there's any lessons learned we can apply elsewhere. But even though these are the areas that are subject to our funding, that doesn't mean other banks can't be created. During this 10-year pilot period for this legislation, anyone can create a bank subject to the limitations in the annual reporting requirements. So what are the takeaways? Well, I don't know enough about how Nevada's water law system works or your hydrology to be able to tell you what to do or what will work well and what won't work or what won't work in terms of actually how to structure your bank. But I do think that there are some takeaways from the process that we use to create our bank that might be helpful, that you might find useful. And I think one of the most beneficial things that we did in our effort is we took the time, like I said, about 1.5 years to not only study how water banking is working elsewhere in other states, but also what our local needs were. We went around the state, we studied a number of different basins to get a sense of what's working now. We don't want to replace that, but we want to come up with an additional tool. What would that look like? And that's what led us to our theme of voluntary, temporary, and local. And had it not been for that effort, I doubt we would have gotten this bill passed. The other thing that I think it's important to recognize is that water banking, and I think this is universal pretty much everywhere, is not a silver bullet. It's just one more tool in a toolbox. It's not going to solve all of our problems. And related to that is it's not going to be suitable everywhere. Not every part of Utah makes sense for doing a water bank. And we've always thought if we could do 5 to 8 of these in the next 10 years, that would be a success. So we're not expecting this to take off everywhere. Although there is a lot of interest, and who knows, maybe we're wrong. I hope I am, but at the current time, I think it's going to be something we'll see in some places, but not all. And there are some places where water banking makes no sense at all. And that's why, again, we want it to be voluntary and locally driven rather than something that's coming from the top down. I think another part of this that's been really effective is that we've taken a slow and steady approach. Again, this is legislation that's going to expire after 10 years, so if it's a bad idea, it goes away on its own. But we also have a built-in assessment process, so we can tweak it and fix it as we go along, rather than just kind of taking a wait-and-see approach. So we're actively, I feel that we've come up with a way to actively fix it if problems arise, and hopefully improve it as we go along. The other thing that I think was really important to our success is this bill wasn't drafted behind closed doors. Anybody who was interested in working on this was allowed to. And I think that really, of course, it added to the time, and it was definitely a committee, a drafting by committee approach, but ultimately that worked. I feel that we came up with something that everyone could get behind, and that's reflected by the fact that the legislature passed it unanimously. We only had one nay vote, and that was in committee, and that particular legislator switched his vote when it came time to vote on the bill on the floor. And that wouldn't have happened, I think, had we not pursued such an open and consensus-driven approach. And the other thing that we did is we did extensive outreach. We held over 40 meetings around the state to talk with stakeholders, to take their comments, tweak the bill, make it better, address their concerns. And I think that was also critical in us getting this bill across the line. And we also developed a lot of outreach materials and a website as well. So here's the website. If you're interested in seeing what our program looks like, this website has more information on it. It also has all the documents and materials that we use to create our program. And again, this was part of our transparency approach to make sure that this didn't come as a surprise to anyone, and anyone who was interested in it could participate and see what we were doing. So with that, I'd be happy to take any questions that you may have.